Today's episode is with Gretchen.
But
As a
AI in our
trusted
field has generally been like, hey, we want to make sure we do a better job of protecting our network and stopping, it's being used by attackers in more ways than we know about, probably, and certainly lots of creative ways. AI, Gen AI fails. It fails miraculously. It fails,
Mhm.
right? Let's not talk about everybody's personal issues, and maybe don't collect that because those ethics are not going to really change so much, right? What's important in cybersecurity should be important to everyone. Inherent risk is a concept that's unfortunately largely absent from organizations that are less mature. It's a compliance function. Did you do it? Did you not do it? If you didn't do it,
Hi everyone, this is Purushottam and thanks for tuning into Scale to Zero podcast. Today's episode is with Gretchen Ruck. As a trusted advisor to established boards, senior executives, and investors, she focuses on helping her clients examine and address the impacts of cyber threats, data privacy regulations, and technology risks on their overall strategy and security program performance. She has held key roles at leading advisory, research, and financial service organizations, and is a frequent writer and speaker on topics ranging from emerging technology trends to cybercrime to inclusiveness and advocacy. Gretchen, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us for the podcast. Uh, mm, before we start, do you want to briefly share about your journey?
sure. Thank you so much for having me on today. I really appreciate it. It's great to speak with you. Yeah, so I started out with one of the big, at the time, eight, which is dating myself, advisory consulting firms back when there were, eight, there's now four of them. But working in IT
Mm-hmm,
overall. And basically, through the 90s, I was working overall, just more generally in IT. And around the year 2000, I started with a global financial organization. And the year that I started, that group was being audited. And as it was being audited, I was watching the auditors and thinking to myself, wow, I'd really like to do what they're doing. So I wound up joining that group, which really shifted my focus to risk, to cybersecurity in
mm-hmm,
particular. And from there, I mean, I've worked a lot in financial services, just in general in consulting companies, doing a lot of work just around simply like everything dealing with risk related to technology and data, so cybersecurity, privacy, some work in fraud. And, over the last 10, 15 years, as my career's progressed, I've worked more and more, I think, with like the top end of the folks, like the suites, the executive suites and such, where it's harder to necessarily communicate, what it is that matters, why it matters, like why cybersecurity is relevant and something they should care about. So that's been a big part of my experiences and journey for the last 10, 15 years as I've branched out and done more. But
mm-hmm.
yeah, it's like in the last couple of years, I find myself doing more things like this, which is really great. Be able to share thoughts with others through things like podcasts, writing, speaking. So this is really cool. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I see that you touched on few areas which we want to get go into in today's podcast. But before we start getting into security questions, we generally ask this question to all of our guests, and we get unique answers, right? So, what does your day look like? And what I mean by that is, apart from let's say work, how do you start your day? Do you have some rituals? How do you wind down? Because that's also a key part of today's life nowadays, right?
Oh yeah, but thank you. Yeah, for a lot of people, of course, COVID has had a big impact on what their day looks like. Right. Some people have had to return back to the office, which is unfortunate. But for everybody else, they've gotten to recoup that time, maybe, yelling from inside their car at traffic that they can't control, or whatever the case is. So we're able to really use the time more for ourselves or family. So
Hmm.
for me and in my household, we start off around doing things with kids because that's our family at the moment. Like so we do children things, take care of getting your kids out the door. And then for me it's usually, reading through my different news feeds and honestly just trying to figure out like has anything changed since yesterday in the world that we're facing. So usually that's a big part of the day for me. I usually try to do things like work out, but it's more usually the middle of the day or at the end of the day. But for me, those are parts of like kind of digesting what it is I've done for the day and trying to keep myself like alert and doing the best work I can is trying to do something every day that just gets me out of the chair because I guess the negative of remote work is it's really easy to get like, oh wow, look, I've got to make 10 steps for the day, versus 10,000 or 2,000. So making sure it's
Mhm.
part of my day has always been a big component of this kind of work remote lifestyle.
Makes sense. And I think one thing that I like from your answer is you start with information diet, as in like some of the newsletters or some of the publications that you follow, you read up to get up to speed in a way, what has happened in the world of cybersecurity while you were asleep in a way. Um, So one of the things that I saw in your intro is you must have seen many technology trends, right, throughout your career. And today we are looking at a new technology, which is Gen AI or AI, right? So often these new technologies bring tools and ideas for cybersecurity and also challenges. So with Gen AI, more and more customers are adopting it and quickly becoming a topic of debate and concern as well. So my first question would be, how do you envision Gen AI playing a role in overall cybersecurity as there is a rise in adoption of Gen AI?
I mean, that's a great question. And you know, I like that as you brought up the topic, Bodo, that it's, you said, AI, then you kind of corrected to Gen AI, because AI
Hmm.
and, machine learning have been part of what we've been doing in our field for quite some time. But AI in our field has generally been like, hey, we want to make sure we do a better job of protecting our network and stopping intruders from getting in. And so we might use AI for that. But that's not general purpose AI that we're seeing today. Those things are
Right,
great.
right.
They do what they're supposed to. They work in like a very closed environment. But this is very different, and this is kind of cool also because it's like I feel like when we all started adopting really cool smartphones, it was like businesses had to adapt and really go, hey, consumers want this. I guess we have to work this into how we do our work too. And so, sort of like, smartphones were driven more by consumers than by business in their growth. And it seems like the excitement around Gen AI has to some degree also been driven more by consumers than by folks
Right.
in profession. So, I mean, it's people professionally are excited about it, but I think it's most folks are reading about it from more consumer sources before they get into it themselves. Just to see, well, what would it look like if I combined a this and a that, whatever it is that they're doing.
Hmm.
So I know that my first time playing with it was just goofing around with my kids. So I think for a lot of people that's cool too. Um, so it's funny, like for cybersecurity, AI is like something we talk about a lot, and it seems like we oscillate between it being something huge that could have the potential to transform like a lot of what we do in our field. It could transform also like all the things we think of as risks to being bigger risks, and maybe even new risks we didn't
Hmm.
see, new, black swan type risks. So everybody's
Yeah.
caught up in that, and there's so much sensationalism around it. We're still at this period where it's cool and it's exciting, but now what? Like did it like it takes a lot more energy to run it. Is it worth it? Like what are we actually getting out of it, right? As a
Hmm.
tool for good. Like I said, these things like AI overall and machine learning have been part of what we do. They're part of our tool set, and that's not going to change, right? So, like with generative AI, I think in cybersecurity we could talk about the risk, but first, if we talk about how it's being used by our colleagues,
Hmm.
the generative,
Hmm.
more general piece, I've seen people using it to write policies, to draft like other parts of their program documentation. And, I just kind of cringe when I see that because you can give a prompt to generative AI, you can take that prompt and you can, give more detail or constrain it, but it's still using very general information. And like if I was still an auditor and I was looking at one of these policies, I'd be able to tell that it was something that was pretty generic. And when you're auditing these things, you're always like, well, how does this really work for you? Yes, this is a good
Yeah.
model, but I don't know if this is really right for you. Can you show me how it's really right for you, your organization? So it's being used, generative AI, by our colleagues like that. It's being used by attackers in more ways than we know about, probably, and certainly lots of creative ways right now overall, right? So, like,
Yeah.
what it,
So I think it lacks that context, right? That you have general information, but it lacks the awareness of the context.
oh yeah, absolutely. And AI, I think that for now and for the foreseeable future, AI is not going to create any new risks for
Hmm.
cybersecurity. What it's going to do is it's going to like magnify the existing vulnerabilities and all the different challenges
Hmm.
and attack types we see now. So it's going to make them come faster, look more savvy, like be frankly stronger attacks, but it's not going to be a new unthought of vector for attack. That could be generations away, if at all. But
Hmm.
it's really not thinking of new things. It's just making it much easier to create a convincing dialogue to fish somebody. It's doing a great job at being undetectable. Helping attacks be
Hmm.
undetectable. I could give lots of examples, but I'm sure you get the idea. There's a lot of ways that a creative and lazy attacker can use this stuff to really do a number on folks, more efficiently than they've ever done before.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like the same set of tool set that we have access to improve our cybersecurity practices, attackers also have the same set of tools, right? And maybe even better. So there are both sides of Gen AI. How you touched on some of these challenges. How do you see this becoming a major pain for cybersecurity practitioners, or do you even see that hey, maybe that's not going to happen?
Oh, it's gonna happen, right? Of course it is. It already is, right? So, but instead of saying how's it going to become a challenge for cybersecurity practitioners, I'd say how's it going to be a challenge for cybersecurity for organizations overall? Because like cybersecurity doesn't
Mm-hmm.
operate as a silo. It doesn't operate by itself. It takes the entire organization, just like the impacts affect everybody in an organization, right? So, just as the general statement, like cyber practitioners are going to be collaborating with leadership, with business departments, of people that are not technical but are very influential,
Mm-hmm.
to understand, like, well, how can our business use this without negative effects? How can our business
Mm-hmm.
like avoid things that might make us look bad in the press? It's going to
Mm-hmm.
be cybersecurity working with users and customers to make sure everybody understands, well, what is a risk? Before we've always talked about cybersecurity training, risk awareness, but it takes it from here to here, right? Because the need for
Mm-hmm.
those things are just so much more when like the attacks become so much more savvy. We need to work together to escalate things that look a little funny, like wow, my computer's
Mm-hmm.
getting a little weird. Maybe before you go, meh, not my problem. But maybe now people will escalate these issues, and maybe people will think of themselves more as like somebody that's going to be helping and coordinating how we respond to these events to see what's really going on because it's just going to be that much trickier.
Right, right, totally. And to follow up on that, right? So one of the challenges that we face with Gen AI is uh, it's sort of like a black box today. We do not have enough knowledge how it works, what data it has been trained on, what type of data does it have access, and things like that. Which begs the question of transparency, right? So can you shed some light on the concept of explainability in AI and why it is important when using AI in for cybersecurity tasks?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's it just I feel like this subject gets plenty of press time because of like when AI, Gen AI fails, it fails miraculously. It fails,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's stories about like an attorney who used cases that never actually happened as as reasoning in front of a judge. These things are just like problematic for sure. AI was doing its
Mm-hmm.
best to help, I'm sure, but fact checking would have been really helpful there, I'm sure. But
Right.
so again, in business, like it really counts to understand the why component of this stuff, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
when one of my kids says, like, I'm going to go jump off the roof of the house, and my answer is, no, don't do that. And they go, why? If I'm in a hurry, the answer is, well, because I said so. Like, don't do that, and the kid may still do it. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't empower them to think through it. It doesn't give them anything to work with. It doesn't help them apply this situation to any other situation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So all of those are very analogous to the business, right? So if this is the answer, we just take it as the answer coming down from some like mighty source, we don't know if it's the right answer. We don't know how to apply this answer to
Yeah.
make ourselves a better organization. It's like using these canned answers with the black box. It damages trust. Like you don't know like whether these things are really reliable or not. It just stymies how we get folks to think rationally. And the thing is, it's like think about Google and Google search, right? So we type in,
Mm-hmm.
like, what is the cutest dog breed, or we type in, like, what's the name of that new attack that did X, Y, and Z, and there's an order to the results, and Google has in a black box determined that order. So
Mm-hmm.
they have promoted the order that they think is appropriate. And it might not be the right order for us, and it frankly might not even be the correct answer. Maybe
Right.
there's a new answer that isn't that popular yet, so it doesn't pop up at the top of the search. We just don't
Yeah.
know, right? So, I mean, these things
Mm-hmm.
become problematic. Or if you think about filter bubbles, I don't do Facebook, but a lot of people get their news from that. And so, Facebook more acts like an echo chamber. They pick up from your past reading habits, from your interactions, where you stand on political spectrums, economic spectrums, and they feed you things that they think you kind of want. And so,
Yes.
so you're not making a choice about what news you follow up on, read more about. They're making that choice for
Mm-hmm.
you, which is, creates a lot of divisions. These things are problematic, right? And this is just gets more into explainability. It's like, some people don't want a lot of detail, but I think everybody wants reliability and
Mm-hmm.
wants to know, what's inside their hot dog. It's like, there's always thing about like people use hot dogs as an analogy to like, oh, it tastes good. I don't care what's in it. Well, you probably do care what's in it, and if you know
Yeah.
what's in it, then you maybe care, that kind of thing. So I think it's very,
Mm-hmm.
very important.
Yeah. And I love your example where you highlighted it. Somebody referred a case which doesn't even exist. And I think some of the organizations who provide the Gen AI capabilities, they say that it's the creativity part of the model as well, right? Where it can think outside of the box and give you some answers. Where at the same time, you have to do some fact checking before you can even use some of the uh, information that you get from these models. Like one of the things that like many programmers do is when you ask a question and you get a response, they maybe write unit tests to figure out if the solution that was provided or the program which was provided by the LLM model, whether that even is valid, because sometimes those are invalid, straight invalid, right? So yeah, I agree with you that there should be some fact checking even though you get some information from these models. Um, so to double click on it, another challenge that comes with this is the user privacy, right? So, how can AI powered security solutions be designed to respect user privacy while effectively protecting against cyber threats?
That's a great question, right? And I think there are a lot of layers to that question because anything that there's this much excitement about is just grows tremendously. And so
Yeah.
while there are no standards, there's no real laws. There's a lot of guidelines, and but there's no really solid laws about don't do this, don't do this. I mean, there are directives, but how they're going to be fulfilled is a different matter. So
Mm-hmm.
you can't force somebody to do the right way or wrong way, whatever even that means yet. So
Mm-hmm.
these things are an issue. So when you're creating these models, people are pulling in generally for the generative AI models anything they can consume, right? If it's out there, they're going to nom it up. And so
Yeah.
what they're trying to do is they're trying to put some sort of curtail on like what the output looks like. So any kind of,
Mm-hmm.
if you think about cybersecurity, we can control input to a model. We can control a model how it processes. We can control
Mm-hmm.
the output. So they're using really output controllers to constrain it. So if they're pulling up all the information there is, I can say to a model, "What do you think about Gretchen Ruck?" And I've done that because,
Mm-hmm.
like, vaguely curious. And so it says there's not enough information about that person to come to a conclusion. Um, so the reality is there's plenty out there if you really want to look. So there's a constraint in place telling you not to do that. There are ways people trick these things, and that's fine. But the thing is, this is not really protecting privacy at the end of the day. This is like one
Mm-hmm.
small component of really what's needed. You know, um, so what it comes down to is, there needs to be rules and regulations about what these models can consume, what's considered intellectual property, what's considered, too private to put into the model. These
Mm-hmm.
things are important. It's like, there are principles of security about need to know. Like, is this something that's vital? Is this something, don't
Mm-hmm.
collect it because you might want it later? Clients make that mistake. Don't keep it because, well, that could be interesting. You keep the data set that you need for your purposes. And I know Gen AI is supposed to be so big in general that well, we might need everything tomorrow, today. But that's,
Right.
that's not really always appropriate. If ethics say, hey, well, let's not like, talk about everybody's personal issues, then maybe don't collect that because those ethics are not going to really change so much, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
so again, there's also, and we could talk more about it, but there's a lot of aspects of PET, so privacy enhancing technology, that can go into this. Privacy enhancing technology is kind of a new emerging field. I think that
Mm-hmm.
folks have heard of it, but what it includes, like how do you categorize in it? That's still something up for debate. I've spoken about it 2 years ago at Stanford. I did a talk about types of privacy enhancing technology. What's effective now? What's something on the cusp of being effective? What's theoretical? But there's a lot of ways to do this stuff better. And like big data. 10 years ago, everybody's like, "Oh, cloud, big data, digital transformation." But big data, like
Mm-hmm.
people were just eating up data. And so this is not the first time we've said, "Well, is too much data too much data?" So these are something that we need to really think a lot about if we're talking about Gen AI.
Yeah, yeah, agreed, totally. And thank you for bringing up privacy enhancing technology. So what we'll do is when we publish the episode, we'll tag that as well, so that folks can go and listen in to your Stanford talk if it is publicly available.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh,
It's on YouTube. Absolutely.
Oh, love that. So yeah, we'll tag that. So one of the things that you mentioned earlier is that with generative AI, this is consumer facing, right? This was not designed only for enterprises, so that regular consumers don't interact with it. It it exploded because regular consumers started using it a lot, right? And that is something we cannot miss out on, right?
Yeah.
As humankind, we often try to play with new technologies, and that comes with, of course, the privacy challenges and all other set of challenges. And there is a new term which is like which is coming up, is differential privacy, right?
Right.
When focusing on privacy. So for our audience, can you highlight what is differential privacy and what role does it play in case of generative AI?
Sure. Absolutely. So just to kind of give a broad view and kind of work my way into something more specific. So I mentioned
Hmm.
again, like privacy enhancing technology is kind of a concept of like what technologies are out there that can do more to protect privacy. And
Hmm.
there's a lot of ways you can do that. And so for me, I break that down into kind of four general categories. Like which of these technologies are used to protect data? So things like encryption, right? Things like decentralizing data, keeping certain data separate. You have things like how you manage data as part of privacy enhancing technology. So this is like
Hmm.
like putting in rules for governing data, having data governance in place, having data classification schema in place, things like that. You have areas like around data control, controlling data, which is filtering. Like what things can we allow through? Again, with generative AI, which results is it okay for us to put out? That's like a filtering function, right? You have data
Hmm.
discovery, things like that are part of it. And then the fourth part of them is it's about altering data, so data altering. And
Hmm.
so this is like what can we do to make the data somehow a little less problematic by changing it. So you can anonymize data, and there are just different ways
Hmm.
you can do that. You can what's called pseudo-anonymized data, which is like masking it. So like if you have a bunch of fields in records, like one of the field is my name, one of the field is other features, but you don't need my name. It just happens to be in this. You can just replace my name field with something that's a token of that. So it doesn't really reflect it. It doesn't get rid of it, but it's so that's how you pseudo-anonymize. But then you can also simulate data, make data that looks like a proper data set, but there's something suspicious about it, so to speak. So either
Hmm.
synthetic data, which is like, hey, developers who are making new versions of software for their company, they want to test it, right, to make sure it really works right, didn't break anything, new features work. So they look for a data set to test it on. They always want to use the real data that their company has, but that usually can be problematic. So instead, can you create like fake data, like a synthetic data set that feels real but isn't? It's tough to do.
Hmm.
Also,
Yeah.
do something called like generative adversarial networking, which is fine. But the technique you just brought about, which is part of altering data through simulation, is differential privacy. So
Hmm.
what it is in this case is like you take a data set. So you could have, it could be everybody's HR file, so like
Hmm.
record of every person is in there. And there's some things that we maybe somebody wants to look at with AI. They want to look to see if who's needed a certain kind of medical care or who's needed to take time off for medical reasons or something like that. And so they want to protect identity. So what they do is they inject noise in the data. So they've got 1,000 people or 500,000 people, depending on the size of your company. And so they may alter some of the data field. So like they'll change Gretchen stuff to say that Gretchen did take medical leave, even though it was inaccurate. And they might add some
Hmm.
employees that didn't exist. They'll add Gretchen Gruck. I don't know, make something up and give them some false data. So most of the data is real. Some of it's been made into something that's called noise. In other words, nearly real. But the idea is that even with whatever percentage of noise is inserted, the overall results of your research will be precise. So it won't be accurate 100%, but it'll be precise enough to use for whatever the thing is that we're trying to learn. But if you look at any individual in that data set, there's a chance that that data may have been altered. So the idea is it's supposed to use some sort of statistics to protect individuals, because for any individual's answer, if somebody actually gets the data that this was trained on, they go, well, I don't know if Gretchen really did do this because I know some of these were altered. Whether it's 2%,
Hmm.
10%, that's different. But people have kind of glommed onto differential privacy as hey, this is really the thing we're going to hang our hat on. Like NIST has a very recent paper on it. But the thing to remember is, like, if you read NIST paper, if you think about it, if you look at this at all, it's really it's for research at this point. Meaning, like, hey, we're researching this as a tool to see if it really works as well as we think. It's got limits for how well it works. There's a
Hmm.
very famous saying that was made popular by Mark Twain. There are three kinds of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics, right? And differential privacy is a statistical model for creating privacy. Like when somebody's
Hmm.
handling my privacy, I'd prefer they just delete my data than potentially statistically make it less reliable, because if
Yeah.
somebody casually is observing the data, they're going to assume that, not that, well, there's a little doubt, but more like this is probably all accurate, no matter what the noise is
Hmm.
inserted. Because it costs money and take times to insert the noise. You have to do lots of testing to make sure it still works. So, I mean, I don't feel great about it. I think this stuff should be used, but probably sparingly for certain research
Hmm.
techniques for like one-time usage. Like if you're doing HIPAA, there's all these protections in place that are required, but there are also exceptions for certain kinds of data sets being used in models for one time only. And so, again, like if you leave something with differential privacy open for future uses, the results may not be good and the privacy may
Hmm.
be good, but for the one use that you've defined, it might be fine. So it's kind of a standout discussion amongst PET, privacy enhancing technologies, is differential privacy. I think another one is confidential computing, frankly. But then there are,
Hmm.
like I said, tried and true techniques like encryption and things like that that also still really are super important to this stuff.
The example that you gave, where let's say my data is altered to for some evaluation or whatever it is, makes me scared that even though maybe I have never gone to a doctor in last 1 year, there is a record somewhere in the database which says that I have, and which is scary, right? Even though it's not accurate data, but some might consider it as accurate because it's in the database, or it's in the tool I'm looking at. It's showing me that information, so maybe I consider that as accurate.
Well, like
So that's.
for me, a more scary version of that is like a lot of companies are interested in adding self-identification to their
Mhm.
diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging programs, and so they'll ask people to self-identify as
Mhm.
being, I mean, maybe being, gay, being transgender, being actually lots of other things as well. And so this data
Right.
is typically kept in an HR file. This is an example
Mhm.
where data should be decentralized, frankly, because of the vulnerability that this data creates. Like, if you have an international company, they ask this question in the US, and maybe that's fine. But if you have employees in another country where being gay could result in going to jail or, something
Yeah.
worse, that's a problem, right? So
Mhm.
playing around with this data and telling people, well, it may not be as accurate as you think, statistically speaking,
Yeah.
won't save somebody's life, and that's something to think
Mhm.
about.
Or we started with a small example, but yeah, the example that you gave makes a lot more sense, right? That it could impact someone's life if the data is the noise that is introduced is thought as truth by someone else, and yeah, it could create more problems than it could solve problems for us. I hope the NIST research that you spoke about, that gives us better results so that we can build frameworks around it and have better guardrails.
But it's not a silver
Yeah,
bullet,
yeah.
right? It's there are no silver bullets, and NIST aims to give people guidelines and help people understand like what good probably
Hmm.
looks like, and that's great. I mean, again, there are EU directives around this too that are very
Hmm.
fantastic, but there's no single
Right,
solution.
right.
We can't just do this without
Yeah,
giving
yeah,
advice.
absolutely, absolutely. So there are two things that you touched in the previous response around NIST and HIPAA. So which are like some of the cybersecurity frameworks which are widely adopted depending on which vertical you are in. But according to you, they are not handled really well. Why do you feel they fall short when it comes to inherent cybersecurity risks?
So, when I was kind of giving my journey, my
Mm-hmm,
background, I mentioned that in the last 10 to 15 years, I've had the pleasure of like working more with
mm-hmm,
boards, like with investors, with like attorneys, with non-technical stakeholders that are very
mm-hmm,
influential. And, you know, when we present security concerns, we have security shortfalls to folks that are in these levels and these positions, they just sort of turn off. Like they become sort of vacated because to them it's like they're like, I've heard this
mm-hmm.
before. I don't know what you're saying now. You're always asking for more money. You know, I'm not doing that. They just
Okay.
turn off. So, the thing is like what's important in cybersecurity should be
Mm-hmm,
important to everyone because it affects all of us in so many ways. And so we need to use something such as
mm-hmm,
inherent risk as our means for creating perspective that people can kind of grasp and go, wow, okay, that does make sense. Inherent risk is a concept that's unfortunately largely absent from the different models you're going to
mm-hmm,
see out there. And reasons why. So like, if I give examples of like I guess the way that it's missed out on, I can certainly do that. But just to begin with, like inherent risk is, well, what is risk? Risk is like the potential damage that could result from
mm-hmm.
threats, both intentional and unintentional ones, that could exploit vulnerable assets. An asset can be a system, it could be data, and exploit could mean it could break it, it could make it not operate the way you want. It could make it less confidential, whatever
Right.
the case is. So that's what a risk. So inherent risk is basically it's the risk to an organization in the absence of any kind of security safeguards. And when you put safeguards in, what you get is what's called the mitigated or
Mm-hmm,
residual risk. So would be most damaging if it happened to an organization that could relate to data or
mm-hmm,
technology. Those things are cybersecurity risks. So we're not saying what are the biggest cyber risks, but what are the biggest risks related to data and technology that an organization could fix that in fact could be treated, mitigated, whatever you
mm-hmm,
want to say, by cybersecurity. So that goes from inherent risk to something that we usually
mm-hmm.
talk about more. So like to give the examples that I was thinking about, like with NIST, NIST cybersecurity framework, the CSF we call it version 2.0 just came out, and there's some pretty big changes. They focus more on governance, more on big topic issues. So I was excited about that because I do a lot in risk, and I figured that would be covered more. Some aspects of risk are, but what isn't covered is anything much about inherent risk. They have one control of the many that are in there, the 100 plus controls, that mentions that threats and vulnerabilities, likelihoods, impacts are used to understand inherent risk and inform how people prioritize and respond to risks. Okay, cool. So then there's nothing in there that says, well, what does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
What's an inherent risk? And if for a dictionary within NIST material, they refer to something outside of NIST, and
Ah,
it's easy to gloss
okay.
over. And there are other things in NIST that do risk, and they don't cover it. If you look at one that people use for risk a lot, which is FAIR, the factorial analysis of information risk, it's this big institute, a big program. They look at a bottom up approach to creating a view of risk, and that sounds great. But they, in fact, in their materials, they say this is what inherent risk is, and they give a good
Mm-hmm.
definition. But then they basically say, but that's too hard. So instead, let's look at the current level of risk, the inherent
Oh.
risk, and the future goal one as maybe the mitigated one. So they just throw out the definition that's useful and say, let's start with this. And the reason that that drives me crazy is because no, like, if you need to be able to think about what's important to protect, and if you need to evaluate comparatively what's more and less important, you need to understand the impact on the organization. And saying, well, what's protected today versus how much more protection to give it doesn't give you any feel for what the organization prioritizes, how much
Right.
risk is really important to the organization. It does none
Mm-hmm,
of that. So it creates this this huge gap that absolutely should be part of these systems.
I want to dig deeper into it. So, if an organization neglects some of these inherent risks, because it's very easy to gloss over, right? As you highlighted, what are some consequences that organizations might face while managing their cybersecurity risk?
Good question. And conveniently, I just published another article last week that deals with inherent risk and looks at some of these
Hmm.
factors. So absolutely, I would suggest viewers have a look at that, where we go into more detail talking about what the problems are and why this is a really important topic and how do you do it. Um, so what the consequences are? Well, basically, you know, cybersecurity has been around for some time. And usually in organizations that are less mature, it's a compliance function. Did you do it? Did you
Hmm.
not do it? If you didn't do it, you might be in
Right.
trouble. So that's what we're used to. Like in not like lacking compliance has gotten a lot of people fired, right? But it's not a very strong way of thinking about things or keeping tabs on what's going on. From there, as groups mature, they start looking at the technology and go, hey, my systems, what's the risk to my individual systems? Do my systems is somebody going to break into them? What does that
Hmm.
look like? And so that's a nice level, and that's something that a lot of organizations have reached. But the ultimate goal should be to help be a partner to business by communicating, hey, what is the value that cybersecurity prices to the business, and how can that value be used as something to drive business? We're more than a cost center, this review says. We're something that, again, is like a value added center to the business. And so you can never get there if you don't look at inherent risk, first of all. You would just focus on compliance. And this compliance mindset, this like looking at technology and the risk each system has mindset, these don't really future proof your systems either. They really look at what's enough today. They don't look at, well, we might be going after this new market, or our business is going to introduce this new
Hmm.
line, and these are the things that are changing. It does nothing like that. So it doesn't help people understand, like, well, does that change our risk profile? What does that do? And when I say value, I mean real financial
Hmm.
value. Because, if you're going to hit somebody, you want to hit them in the pocketbook, like hit them where it hurts, but also explain to them where they can understand it. There's this much potential for damage if nothing is done. So mitigated, there's this much damage. But if you do this new thing, it could go up and down. And so this is a big part of what you're missing out on in an
Yeah.
organization. And it stops organizations really from like progressing to be more efficient with
Hmm.
cybersecurity, to get their budgets to be justifiable, to make everybody their ally.
Makes a lot of sense. One thing that you touched on, which I wanted to uh, touch on as well, is the age-old debate of compliance versus security, right? Where some folks are very compliance heavy. If you are in a regulated industry, you have to be compliant with some of the frameworks, versus some which are very security focused. Finding that balance sometimes is a challenge. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. One,
So, but to be clear, it doesn't always have to be separate though, too,
yes,
because
yes.
like if you look at New York's DFS, their financial regulator,
Hmm.
they specifically in the regulations point out that boards of directors need to be educated in a manner that they can exercise good oversight or good governance of cyber risk. So, in other words, like if once a year you're giving a presentation because you've been asked to get in front of the board, and you're like, yeah, these are the things we're working on now. We're going to try to do better. That doesn't give them the ability to really make decisions or help you make decisions about, risks and which ones are acceptable and which ones are too much. So, there are regulators that are trying to, not many, but some that are trying to push folks to, hey, you have the compliance mentality, but guess what? Compliance is changing to include this.
Hmm.
So that's kind of a very positive thing to
Yeah,
see.
thank you for highlighting that as well. Yeah, you're absolutely right. These are not like two different spectrums. They work together to improve your overall security, and which makes sense. Um, Now that, let's say, I understand the value of the inherent cybersecurity risks, as an organization, what key considerations should I think about? Should I prioritize when addressing these inherent cybersecurity risks?
So that therein lies the rub. The reason that folks don't do this often is because they find that they're getting confused by getting different answers. They find that cybersecurity is so complex.
Hmm.
There's really no way to kind of put a name on these things. It's hard. And so folks are busy with their daily jobs. There's just so many reasons why folks don't do this, and I think they don't have the confidence to necessarily bring it up. So a lot of times now, the way we're doing cyber risk, measuring it, talking about it, is bottom up. They go, hey, well, these are the things we do well.
Hmm.
Some people might say, well, if you were attacked, would those things that you do well be enough to prevent your attack, to detect you're being attacked, to really do the right things to recover fully from it? So maybe people get to that level, and that's better than just saying, "Hey, do we follow a framework?" But we need a top-down piece of it, which this is going to introduce, which says, "Okay, so maybe you're vulnerable to attack, but is that attack going to really hit us where we're most concerned?" And where we're most concerned, usually we have a good idea. If any company has a business continuity program, if they've got disaster recovery plans, their organization has identified, well, what are the critical systems to our to make our business run? What are the business processes that are critical to serve our customers? What are the pieces of data that we need to make sure we can restore, we
Hmm.
can use, we can't get wrong? So these are all part of those plans. So you know this is part of what we need to get there, and it's not something you can overlook. So I talk about in my paper, what I've done is, and this is what folks overlook is this part of it. I've taken, inherent risk and I've broken it down into pieces that anybody can understand. It's just like I've created a model to make it simple. I've created like 5 categories
Hmm.
of, of kinds of risks that organizations face. Depending on what they do, these could be more or less important. You have things like espionage, right? So it could be state sponsored espionage, it could be corporate. You have some sort of abuse of personal data. You've got business disruption or destruction of property or data. You've got something dealing with like endangerment, endangering people, deceiving people into taking other actions, and you've got financial crimes. I have 5 categories, and for each of those I create 2 risk scenarios that that could be used to kind of drive into what a business does and how they work. And that's all it takes, really, to fully investigate in, like this bit of inherent risk. And to do this work, it's not a ton of work. It's like it's a couple meetings with your high level folks, your board maybe. It's really just a quick process to get everybody on the same page. All the work you're doing all along feeds it. This is just a way to create a shared journey to get people using business terms. Like if we pick like one of the 5 categories, you know, personal data abuse. Like the two
Hmm.
scenarios I have there is, exposure of customer or employee data. So exposure of personal data. It means we didn't do enough to protect it. Somebody broke it and stole it.
Hmm.
Somebody, one way or another, there's too much data that's out there. So that's one of the scenarios. And we can think of a lot of ways that people in certain consumer facing businesses care about it. If you're in retail, you care about it. If you're doing business to business work and you never touch personal information, then it's not important to you. But for some, it is. And the other scenario I have in that category is disregard for privacy rights, or exploitation of data. So just because you can find a public source for data doesn't mean you should.
Yeah.
So if I haven't consented to you capturing this information about me for marketing purposes and pairing it up with information that you may already know about me, so you can try to sell me stuff that I don't want you to try to sell me, like that's abusive and that's often illegal as well. But so these are areas again that might focus on personal data, but these
Hmm.
are scenarios in that category. So this is what's lacking in this conversation is like a model for kind of grounding the discussion and sort of a reminder that the only way to really express to people what's at risk is going, well, what's the most valuable to us? Maybe it's our customer data,
Hmm.
maybe it's our secret sauce, maybe whatever it is. So we look at how attacks could be successful or not based on our risks and how much it exposes those very specific things we're talking about.
What we'll do is when we publish the episode, we'll also tag the new paper that you have written so that folks can go in and read how you have structured it, right? By different areas, and they can get benefit of it and use it for communication with the leadership and also for prioritization work when it comes to addressing the inherent cybersecurity risks. And
Yeah,
yeah,
and
again,
I think it's yeah. I mean, to me, it's like it's a paper I wrote because it's a tool I've been using that I developed, and it just nobody does this right. And when I saw that this CSF did nothing, I'm like, this is ridiculous. It's time to create something that people can use.
yeah,
You know,
absolutely. And thank you for doing that. And thank you for even going through different types of inherent risks that you have highlighted in the paper so that that works
sure,
as a brief overview of what you are covering in your paper. So we'll definitely share that with our
good.
audience.
Okay.
Uh, Before we go to the next section, which is rating security practices, I have a question from one of our friends, which is Jeffrey Wheatman, and his question is, "What's your opinion on difference between cybersecurity, risk management, and privacy?" We touched on all of these, so yeah, what's your opinion on the differences between these three areas?
So cybersecurity, the way we use it now, is it's a an organizational control function.
Mm-hmm.
So human resources is an organizational control function. It makes sure that you have the right people getting paid and getting care. And cybersecurity is a control function too. And make sure the right people get access to things, the right things are protected. So cybersecurity, in the perfect world, we wouldn't need cybersecurity, but it exists to protect things.
Mm-hmm.
To technology protect data. So I see cybersecurity as one of the tools in the toolbox that helps to protect organizational interests such as privacy, such as like managing fraud, such as protecting users from doing stupid things. But so the thing is, it's a tool, it's a control in the whole system, and
Mm-hmm.
risk management really the means to understand which of these tools needs to be applied in what circumstances and in what combination. The tools being, again, things like HR, things like finance, things like cybersecurity, to make sure that we're fulfilling the needs of consumer privacy, the needs of protecting folks against fraud, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the.
Okay. Thank you for sharing your response. We'll share it with Jeffrey as well, so that he gets his answer. Uh, so that.
I think he knows the answer. I've known him for a very long time, and before he was gray, which he is now. So, but he's just trying to make it fun. That's good.
Yeah, yeah, we love that. And that brings us to the end of the security question sections. Thanks, Gretchen, for the insightful conversation. Here is a summary from our conversation today. Gen AI tools are good at generic information, but it often lacks contextual awareness. Building contextual awareness to the Gen AI tooling will give organizations the maximum benefit of this new technology trend. The second one is data privacy and privacy enhancing technology play a crucial role in organizations' Gen AI strategy. Enough guardrails should be put in place to ensure privacy is at the top of the mind. Third and the final one is inherent risks are difficult to understand. And that could be one of the reasons some of the cybersecurity frameworks gloss over it. But it's equally important for the success of cybersecurity programs. Thank you. The next
Okay,
section is rating security practices, where
right.
the idea is I'll highlight a practice and you need to rate from 1 to 5. So the first one is conducting periodic security audits to identify vulnerabilities, threats, and weaknesses in your systems and applications.
As a former auditor, I'd love to say five, but I think that this should be limited to like probably three or above or below. So I'd say three. The reason why is like it's absolutely mandatory. Like there's so many times I've been to organizations that say they have an annual vulnerability assessment pen
Hmm.
test, and they give you last year's and you go, wow, did you fix these? And they go, nope, nope, let's do this year's. So that stinks, but it is a really important control. But the reason I would limit it out of three is because it's not like a key control. It's not protective. It doesn't stop something from going wrong. It just goes, that's what went wrong and why. So things that are like reactive like this and not protective
Mhm.
are never going to be your top controls.
Okay, no, that makes sense. The second
Yep.
one is usage of strong password that contain a mix of uppercase, lowercase letters, numbers, symbols, and changing it frequently, and avoid using the same password for multiple accounts.
It's better than not having any password, but beyond that, it's not good. So like a one or a two, maybe, right? Um, you know, Everybody in our field, and I wish everybody in the world knew that like multi-factor authentication is it.
Mhm.
So this is not strong. It's not helpful, and it's amazing to me that there's still banks that don't offer customers multi-factor authentication. And if they do, it's bad multi-factor authentication.
Yeah.
So the bad passwords are just the worst. And it's everybody knows this, but it's sort of finally has gotten out through other sources that like changing passwords regularly for no reason is terrible. It
Mhm.
means that it just forces people to leave their passwords around and
Yeah.
come up with less memorable things that they have to store somewhere. And God forbid you even just store it in a password vault because a lot of them have been shown to be leaky.
Hmm.
So, let's not make people change them unless there's a really good reason. And, let's just keep pushing the MFA multi-factor authentication bandwagon forward.
Yeah, absolutely. MFA has become like a standard nowadays, right? Like pseudo standard that everyone should follow it. Uh,
Absolutely.
the last one is granting users unrestricted access to systems and applications so that we can move fast and new capabilities can be rolled out.
I would definitely say one, except for me personally. So whenever I join an organization, of course I want that. So like I'd say like no, I want the unrestricted access. I want to learn about us. But the reality is it's definitely a bad practice. All organizations like sit on a spectrum between allowing a lot of things and restricting a lot of things. And some organizations collaboration and ingenuity are an important part of what they do. Like if you're working in a university setting,
Hmm.
you really put in few restrictions because you want people to know what's going on and try new things. It's not like working for the Department of Defense or something, which is the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah,
But overall, unrestricted access is, it should never be the case.
makes sense. And thank you so much. That brings us to the end of the podcast. But before I let you go, one last question is: do you have any recommendation for our audience? It can be a blog or a book or podcast or anything.
Yeah, I'm going to say read something other than things in our field, please. I think that as much as I like to start the day by seeing what the news is, especially as it relates to like our field and whether new regulations, all that good stuff. I've got various books on my nightstand, and I can tell you none of them have to do with cybersecurity. If they do, it's probably because it's a science fiction book or something. Um, but no, get out there and find new things to read. If you don't read fiction, you're just missing out because like that's the stuff that really just makes you think, what if? And it's the stuff that really drives new ideas in our field. So, um, you know, find what that is. Like I listen to so many podcasts. I think one of my favorite is called Lightspeed, and it's just a science fiction podcast. They have new science fiction stories all the time, and I like it because it's all about the what if, right? It's about
Hmm.
what's next and what could be future. And so much of science today is based on science fiction of the past. And
Hmm.
so like do yourself and do all of us a favor and keep your mind open to new things by keeping an eye on these new things out there by reading fiction.
I love that recommendation because most of the times we even read around our work. That way,
Absolutely.
we never detach from the work, right? So this is a good way to detach
Yeah.
and be imaginative as well, like creative as well. So yeah, that's a great suggestion. Um, with
Good.
with that, we come to the end of the podcast. Thank you so much, Gretchen, for
Thank you.
joining and sharing your journey and your insights with us.
Thank you very much for having me on. This was a pleasure.
Absolutely. And to our audience, thank you so much for watching. See you in the next episode.